Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. Now, if you had watched my first episode, you may remember that I mentioned wanting to cover episodes that weren't photography specific, but were just about animals and animal science and animal behavior in general. So, my last couple of episodes have just been about animal photography. So, today I'm switching it up. I'm going to be talking with Sarah Grace, who is a wildlife photographer and professional bird bander from Ontario, Canada, and we're going to be talking about bird banding. And I'm sure I'll learn a lot because I don't know a ton about bird banding. I mean, I know some basic stuff, but yeah, I'm excited. But before we get into it, Sarah, do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a first year university student at the University of Guelph. I've lived in Ontario my whole life. I started getting into wildlife photography about 3 years ago and birding, and I've just like really gotten into bird banding recently. And I actually have a job this summer working at a bird observatory, which is super exciting. So yeah.
That's a pretty sweet job. I do electrical assembly where I build little metal boxes right now. So yeah, bird banding is probably cooler. Now, you said you started about 3 years ago or so. What was the first kind of encounter with a wild animal that got you into it? Was it just kind of like a gradual, just a bunch of events in your life stacking up that kind of led you to be like, oh, birds are pretty cool? Or was it one specific instance?
No, actually, it was like a very specific moment that I can pinpoint in time, which is pretty cool. And it's like a fun story I can tell people about. It was the summer of 2019, and I was up at my family's cottage, and I was just sitting on the deck, and it's like up in Muskoka, Ontario. So it's just really nice, deciduous, like coniferous forest mix. Like there's tons of birds around, but I obviously wasn't really looking at them then.
Mhm.
But anyway, I was just sitting outside with my camera, and I saw like this bright orange bird up in the canopy, and I took this really bad picture of it, but it just like stood out to be right. It's like really small, but like the bright orange throat. And I went back inside, and the person we bought the cottage from, she left a bunch of old field guides. So, like these are really old field guides, but I'm flipping
Mhm.
through the pages and I find this like bright orange bird, and it turned out it was a male Blackburnian warbler. So that's what got me into birding.
So you had a camera at the time, right? Were you just into photography in general, or?
I wasn't really taking photos of wildlife then. I just had like a pretty like basic camera and setup. I guess it wasn't very good, but
Mhm.
and I didn't know what I was doing, but thought the bird was interesting, so I just took a photo and everything escalated from there.
Yeah. I mean, Blackburnian's a pretty good spark bird. I didn't really get into birds until like a couple years into my whole wild. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I've been into it, but I didn't really get into birds until maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. Maybe yeah, around 3 years ago. I mean, I love birds in general, like owls. You're mentioning the field guides is like the really old hand drawn ones. It's funny because all the birds look great, and then the owls just look terrible. Like the owl, I don't know if you've noticed that, but they just look atrocious.
No, it looks like a 2-year-old did them. I don't know what's
Yeah,
going on with that.
no, it's always the owls. It's kind of like the taxidermy too. Like taxidermied animals. I mean, owls specifically are just always the worst. But yeah, I mean that's a pretty good story getting into it. Blackburnian warbler. You can't go wrong with that, right? Now, you kind of went from seeing a Blackburnian warbler to getting into bird photography and birding and birds and stuff, and then you become a bird bander. But for anyone who's listening, like, what is bird banding exactly? Can you describe the process and how it works?
Yeah, okay. So one of the main sort of bird banding practices is called migration monitoring. So that's when in the migration season in the fall and the spring for a couple stretches at a time is like when there's peak migration, we go out and we're capturing birds to get like a general idea of what birds are moving through the area at one time. So when we're migration monitoring, we go out half hour before sunrise every morning and we open the nets, and the nets are these sort of large panels. They're 12 meters long and 3 meters tall, and the birds get caught in them, and they're really safe and soft, and like the birds don't really hurt themselves in the nets. And then every half hour we go and we check the nets, we check all the nets, we take all the birds out, and then we bring them back to the lab. And then once they're in the lab, we start banding them. And have you seen bird banding before? Do you know sort of how it works?
I do know so how it works. Yeah, I visited a sawwet banding place one time and I got to watch that.
Yeah, nice. The sawets are really good. But anyway, like you have when you're taking the birds out of the nets, you put them in these little drawstring bags, I guess, and each bird goes in its own bag, and they go in the bag so that they stay nice and calm and they're easy to move. And then when we get back in the lab, we sort of hang the birds up. We have a bunch of bags hanging along, and then you start processing them. So once you take a bird out of a bag, the first thing you do is you put the band on, which is a little small aluminum band, and each band, they're government issued, and each band has a 9-digit number, which is unique to that band and that bird. Sort of gives it like its own identification, I guess. And then if that bird is recaptured somewhere else, they can read that band and the data, and then we can see where the bird is gone and get all that interesting recapture data.
Awesome. When you're banding, I don't know if you mentioned this, but like when you put out the mist nets, right? Do you guys use any kind of audio thing to draw the birds in, or are you literally just like in a random place in the field and the birds just fly into them like at random?
Yeah, so when we're migration monitoring, the nets are we just set them up in areas that I guess we think would be good for birds moving through. So if there's like, sort of a hedgerow, and you can sort of predict where the birds are going to move through.
Yeah.
But at these migration monitoring sites, the nets are in standard places. So they've been in these same places every migration season for however many years, like at Long Point, over 50 years. So then you can get a good data set about how the birds are changing and which ones are coming through every year.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought I brought it up because, as I said, I went to a saw-whet banding place a long time ago, and they would use like a saw-whet call to bring the saw-whets in. And then they would kind of fall into the nets and everything. Do you do saw-whet banding or?
Yeah, I have done it before, and they
That's
do it
awesome.
here in the fall. They'll be back at school when they start doing it. But yeah, it's like the sawas, they're just so charismatic, like it's a good way to get people interested in birds. The good thing about bird banding is it creates a lot of public outreach for conservation. But like sawas it's just a memorable experience if you go to a saw-whet banding.
Yeah, they're just the best. I remember they had this like raffle where you'd put your name in like a bucket, and if they drew your name out, they would put the saw-whet on your arm and they'd release it off your arm. And I was like one of the first people that was able to get the draw, it was really cool. Mine didn't. I mean, we had some people who would just sit on their arm for like 20 minutes, not 20 minutes. Okay, that's a huge example, but like a minute straight, it would just sit there. But mine they put it down and instantly just left, which is depressing. But the first time I went, they caught nothing. And then the second time I went, they caught like 7 or 8 of them in one night, which was pretty cool. But yeah, now when you're looking at bird banding, I think I've had a lot of people ask, like, or just like in discussion, I've heard like, what's the point of bird banding? Because some people are worried, like, oh, it stresses the birds and there's no point in it, blah, 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 blah. So what does bird banding do? What's the end goal with it?
So I think the end goal is to really further conservation for birds and just like promote like conserving different bird species, and obviously promoting habitat protection as well. But like all this data we're collecting, so we're not just putting the bands on, we collect other data too. Like you probably saw with the saw-whet bandings, we determine how old the birds are, we determine their sex if we can, and then we take like wing measurements and we weigh them and we see how much fat they have, et cetera, et cetera. But with this data, researchers can sort of answer any outline questions they might have, and with these questions they can develop, I don't know, guidelines for conservation in the future.
Yeah. And I'd also imagine like recaptures are pretty, interesting thing too, because you guys see where birds pop up again. I know you mentioned that like earlier when you were talking about that. I keep going back to the saw-whet experience because it's the one bird banding experience I've had. But, I'm in Massachusetts, and one time they brought up how they had banded, I don't know if it was in that exact station, but in one of the stations in Massachusetts, they had banded a saw-whet that got banded in Montana, like all the way out west, and then it just showed up over here. So is it like how does recaptures, does that help with conservation, or is that just kind of like a cool side effect, like, oh, this bird popped up over here?
No, I think it helps with conservation because, like, especially with migration, we don't know a ton about migration because it's obviously hard to track when birds are migrating. It's easier now because there's new technologies for radio tracking birds, which is going to help a lot in the future. But just like seeing how birds move, and sometimes like we'll band a bird up here in migration and then it'll get recaught in South America, and we can see how the habitats down there and how far the bird has gone, and gives us like longevity records too. So you could see, like, I don't know, if a rose-breasted grosbeak lived like 5 years, that'd be a pretty cool record since songbirds don't usually live very long.
Yeah, with all the hawks and stuff, I can only imagine why. With radio tagging specifically, I know there's like Project Snowstorm with the snowy owls and larger animals, larger birds that they're able to put radio tracks on. But how does it work with passerines? Are people doing that now? And how big of a songbird are we talking about? Also, like hummingbirds, are we able to put those on hummingbirds now? Do you know or not?
I have no idea about hummingbirds, but I know like birds as small as warblers were starting to do that. There's like a specific project in Ontario with cerulean warblers right now,
Mhm.
which are a species at risk in Ontario because of habitat loss. And
Yeah.
we're just trying to see like how they're migrating. So they're like target netting those. So there they would use playback to bring them into the nets and
Mhm.
like capture them. But then they're starting to put, they're called modus tags. So they're like a small tag and it basically attaches over their wings and their legs like a little backpack and it just stays on,
Yeah.
and it doesn't hurt at all. But then there's like Modus towers, which are basically small satellite towers, and if the bird flies by there, it'll ping. So it'll
Mhm.
be, this is the first year they're doing the Modus tag on the cerulean warblers, so we'll see if there's any interesting data about them going back to their wintering grounds.
That'd be cool. Yeah. Is it similar to, because I know a lot of mammals and like mammal conservation and stuff, they'll use like GPS collars on them. Is it because you mentioned like it's going by a radio tower and it's pinging that? Is that the main way they're tracking them, or does it have like GPS in it where you can just track all of its data points where it's moving around? Or
So the ones I know about, like the Modus tags, those are specifically just pinging
okay.
towers that are designed to, I guess, connect with those tags.
Mhm.
But I know there are some radio ones as well, like the Canada Jays up in Algonquin Park in Ontario. Those are radio tags, so you can go around with the monitors and find where they are.
And just find them. That's really cool. That's awesome. Now, with bird banding, I've heard, I mean, a lot of people have concerns about like whether or not it hurts them at all. I've listened to a podcast a long time ago on bird banding, and they were mentioning like some of the different kinds of bands. Like I know there's some more like color coded ones that are like plastic. I don't know if they're used in Canada or the US, but I've heard that those may have some issues. So what are like the potential hazards for birds in during either the bird banding process or after it, or are there any at all? Or
So I don't think the bands would pose any issues at all because the bands, there's a bunch of different sizes, and depending on species, they take different sizes, and they're like a bracelet, so they can spin around and move up and down the tarsus, which is the bare part of the bird's leg, and
Mhm.
they can move around, but they can't come off, so it's very safe. And then yeah, we do color banding here, but that's mostly for like species specific projects, so like the cerulean warblers,
Yeah.
or if you're doing, there's a lot of like shorebird projects that are using color bands because shorebirds are pretty easy to respot, and then you could just, I mean, you can re-report them using the colors instead of having to read the whole band, which is valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Do the piping plovers have that, or is that just a metal band? Because I know, like in the Great Lakes population, are like endangered and stuff.
Yeah, no, all the piping plovers here, I have never seen one without a band. They all have color bands and they all
Mhm.
have metal bands, like they all get the state issue bands, but then some of them have little flags too with a number on it, so it's even easier to read.
Yeah, the that's crazy. In my area, I think in Massachusetts they're threatened, I believe. I could be wrong, but I don't think I've ever seen one with a band on it. I mean, there's so many beaches here where they're just there. Also, people will talk about like stressing the birds, and maybe this will tie into ethics a little bit. I do want to. I've been thinking about holding off ethical discussions until a little later in the podcast because it's kind of a heavier topic. But I know a lot of people will say like, "Oh, well, banning the bird stresses them out," and like, well, bird banders can stress out birds. I can stress out birds as a wildlife photographer, you know. So I've heard that. What's your like general take? We don't want to go too deep into it, but like basic thoughts.
Yeah, no, what someone told me one time, like someone I was working with, and it's just sort of stuck with me, is that getting caught and like being banded for the bird is just one stressor in a day full of stressors. Because when a
Mhm.
bird is migrating, they're dealing with so many different things all at once. They're coming into this new area and it's completely new, and there could be a hawk or like you said, like a photographer there. So like them getting caught and then us spending, I don't know, at most like 45 minutes with this bird isn't gonna cause a significant, uh, it's not gonna hurt the bird.
Yeah. Did you say 45 minutes?
Yeah, so like on a very busy day, we would sometimes maybe like hold a bird max 45 minutes, but like because
Mhm.
sometimes you'll get days where you're banding for like 700 birds.
Yeah.
So then like you get sort of a lineup of them.
Mhm.
But if it's a slower day, we can get through the birds in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I got you. I heard that I was listening to a podcast on bird, as I mentioned, on bird banding a while ago. This was months ago, so I don't have a ton of it left in my brain. But they were mentioning that some birds, some species were more at risk of dying due to stress during the process than other species. I don't remember which species they mentioned, but do you know anything about that or?
Yeah, so like you have to obviously be aware of that, and it depends on the conditions too. So, if it's like a colder day and you catch, I don't know, like a bunch of ruby crown kinglets, they're more prone to stress because they're smaller. And if they're hanging in the nets, they're sort of more exposed to the weather.
Mhm. Yeah.
So we would want to try and get those ones first because we want to get them on their way as fast as we can. We don't want to hold them long and cause them more stress.
Mhm. I got you. Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Now, you're a wildlife photographer too, right? And you're doing the birding and the bird banding and wildlife photography. Has any of the information that or like experiences that you've had through banding, have any of those kind of helped your wildlife photography from like a behavioral standpoint? Like knowing the animal's behavior, I mean.
So like indirectly, I guess, but it's mainly helped with my birding because
Yeah.
I've been able to spend so much time with experienced birders. I mean, like, and I spent the whole spring at Long Point. I spent 5 weeks there. Just like after my last exam, I just like up and left and went to Long Point for 5 weeks. So,
Mhm.
I mean, you're spending at least 6 hours out in the field every single day.
That's
And so
wild.
you
Yeah.
just become accustomed to learning everything, and you get to know everything super well. And then I think like knowing the sound ID is really, really helpful for photography. I think I've said this before, but sort of being able to pick and choose which birds you want to go after really helps.
I am terrible at sound ID. It's kind of an issue. There's the basics like crows and robins. I mean, that stuff. But I remember one time it was warbler migration, and I heard this song that sounded really cool. I think this was last spring, and I was like, "That sounds badass. I'm gonna go after that." And I trudged like 10 minutes through the woods looking for this, and hoping I didn't get ticks or anything. I was hoping to find like a Canada warbler or a black burnian or something, and there was just a black and white just sitting there, and I'd already seen like 10 that day. Yeah, I think knowing, and this is kind of tying into my last episode that I had with Jack, knowing the knowing your subject helps a lot, because if you don't know it, you might end up walking, a couple hundred yards, and eventually it's like a freaking black and white warbler or something. I learn the warbler calls every year, and by the end of the spring, I'm able to recall them pretty well. Like I'm able to hear and be like, okay, that's that. But then the next summer rolls around, and next spring rolls around, I've just lost all of it. I mean, the only one I remember, I think, is black-throated blue, because they're my favorite. I might have kept black-throated green from this spring, and then maybe yellow warbler. And then after that, it's just, I can't remember anything. Like, I know it's a warbler. I can probably tell that, but that's about it.
Yeah, I know it's a struggle, like definitely when you're first sort of learning and like getting it into your head how to remember them. I
Mhm.
think I took like a course with the Cornell Lab that helped me a lot, and it showed like the spectrographs, and then I think watching the bird as it's singing and like making that mental connection, oh, like that bird is singing that song, has helped
Yeah.
me a lot.
Mhm.
And then also mnemonics helped me a lot personally. I know a lot of people have fun with those. You can sort of come up with your own things for each bird.
Mhm. Yeah. Who cooks for you for barred owls and whatever. I'm able to get the owls down. I know that's extremely easy and not much of an accomplishment regardless. But yeah, I mean, learning the calls is a really valuable thing. I'm gonna have to get better at it. And anyone who's listening who hasn't done it, you should, because it helps a lot. Um, when you're banding birds, are there any specific birds that are kind of like your favorite birds to band?
So, like obviously Blackburnian warblers, just because
Yeah.
they're sort of special to me. But all
Mhm.
warblers are good because, like, I mean, when you first start banding in the spring, you're just getting sparrow and sparrow and sparrow and sparrow, which is nice. But
Yeah.
then, like, you're just wanting the warblers to. But then all of a sudden, they all come, and it's just like I don't know, it's just incredible seeing all these different colors. They are kind of annoying because they do like breeding and non-breeding plumage, which makes them a bit difficult to age sometimes, because when we're aging them, we look at the different feather tracks and see if we can see like a difference between like younger feathers and older feathers. But
Mhm.
having the two molts can make it a bit challenging. But I mean, they're still really fun. And when you're holding them, they just sort of sit there and accept their fate. They just go into a passive state. Some birds
Yeah.
are more fiery when you're banding, but warblers are great. They just sit there.
Yeah, that's something I noticed with the saw-whets, like their personalities. Like some of them just were like really angry and they kept like snapping their beaks, and then other ones would just go into like a catatonic state where they would just bit like roll over basically. You just give up. um yeah, I think warblers, if I were to ban, I would really, if I were to get into it, I'd really want to ban an indigo bunting. I think that would be pretty awesome. I just, their color is crazy, you know. Have you've banded one before or?
Yeah, I've banded a couple. They're just really nice. Like even the females are nice, even the females, but they're nice because like they have the tinges of blue.
Yeah, it's my indigo spot I have. It's like on top of a mountain, and there's a bunch of prairie warblers there as well. It's a really fun spot to be at. But I saw a female the other day, and it's like it looks like a sparrow. You know, it's just this just completely brown bird. And then it lands there, and at first I was like, I thought it was a song sparrow or something. I looked through my camera, I'm like, oh, that's an indigo bunting. You know, it's crazy. It also, you know, I'd imagine you were mentioning like with the different molts of the warblers that it might be hard to age them and stuff. Can you describe like the full process that you go through with aging different birds, or is that like, is it just way too wildly different for each species? You can't really even.
No, there's like a general trend, but
Mhm.
it's pretty in depth. So in the spring, if we're catching like a white-throated sparrow, for example, what we're looking for is how worn the feathers are. So a bird that was hatched the previous summer. So if we caught it in the spring and it was hatched the previous summer, that would make it a second year bird.
Yeah.
If we saw like a second year bird, it would have like this tail would be really ratty and really gross. And then you'd be able to see a contrast between in its wing, you'd be able to see a contrast between the primary coverts and the secondary coverts, which are sort of like the top part of the wing. When you fold them in, you can see a difference. But warblers are just more complicated. And then like in the fall, there's different ways to age them too. So for example, red-eyed vireos, an adult bird would have a completely red eye. But if we caught a bird in the fall that had been hatched that summer, so a hatchier
Mhm.
bird, its eye wouldn't be totally red. So that's a really easy one.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people like measuring all the different wing feathers and stuff, but I didn't really know what it meant. You know, I also I've seen pictures of people weighing them, and they put them in like a cup and they just put them on a scale, and it's probably the funniest thing I've ever seen. Do you guys do that or?
Yeah, we do that. So there's a couple different ways you can weigh them, but obviously if you just take the bird and you put it on the scale, it's gonna fly right off. But
Yeah, yeah.
so we have these little tubes. Sometimes like pill bottles work, and you like for a warbler, and you just sort of put them in upside down, and they just sit there,
They just sit
and
there, yeah.
their tail sort of sticks up. And people are always concerned, like, oh, what's happening to that bird? It's like they're fine. They're just sitting in there. They're nice and calm, and then
Mhm.
they get to be released right after. It's always the last thing we do.
Yeah, that's so funny. It's just you see the pictures of it and it's just like so goofy looking because they're just like their tail sticking up and it's yeah. If somebody, I mean, if somebody wants to, how did you get your job as a bird bander? Was it just through doing a bunch of volunteering or?
Yeah, so when I first started bird banding, actually, I got interested because I saw some videos online of like
Mhm.
someone holding a bird, like turning it around. I was like, oh, that's so cool. I need to start doing that. So
Yeah.
I just reached out to a local naturalist club and they sort of pointed me in the right direction. And this was last spring I started
Yeah.
banding. So I've been doing it for just over a year now. And then just like volunteering at a bird observatory, just like putting the time in. It's such a great experience. You get to meet so many great people and just spend so much time outside. So there's nothing bad about it, I'd say. And then now I have the experience to actually be able to get a job doing it, which is a bit mind blowing to me, but
That's
it's nice.
crazy. Yeah, so I mean, it's just as easy. Like all you have to do is reach out to somebody to do volunteer work, and then they just say like yes, or there's no prior experience you need for that.
No, like most bird observatories, if you're going there for an extended period of time, they'll train you, and some of them will like house you for free. Like Long Point
That's cool.
is a pretty famous bird observatory for like
Mhm.
international people because you can just go there and you basically stay there for free, and all your food and expenses are paid for, and you just band birds and spend your time doing that.
That's insane. I might. Wow. I didn't know. I thought it was like a process to volunteer for bird banding. I didn't really know how to go through that. I might, I don't know, I might try that someday. I'm like I've been thinking about it, but I haven't gotten around to it. But I might because that sounds like a blast. I think I know exactly who you're talking about, like the video of the turning the birds in their hand, you know, on like Instagram, you know. Yeah. I think I've seen people, they post those videos, but they also do photography. Now, I mean, I know this is kind of like your job, so I'd imagine you're pretty busy when you're banding birds, but do you ever get the chance to do like creative photography with birds that you're banding, like a plumage shot or a detail shot or something like that?
I've never really tried it. Yeah, I think like you said, I'm always busy. Like if we catch a cool bird and there's enough people around, I'll like get my camera and take a photo of it just so we can have a nice photo for like the birders to post on their social media or whatever. But
Yeah.
I haven't tried anything super creative. I don't know. I wouldn't want to hold the bird for longer than we have to. The general rule is like you don't hold it in photographer's grip, which is like how you see them when they're turning them around. You don't want to hold them like that for over a minute
Mhm.
because it's just putting extra stress on their legs and you don't want to risk anything happening. But I don't think I'd ever try that personally.
I got you. I got you. Now, you've been banding for over like around a year, over a year. What is your best banding story that you've had?
Oh, there's a few. It's hard to choose
Just go
from.
through all of them.
So
I
we
mean, you don't
caught,
have to pick
I
one
don't know if,
specifically.
well, I think probably saw the photo, but we caught a pileated woodpecker recently, which is just like a really nice bird to catch because
Mhm.
like they're around our sites, but they don't go in the nets often. But this one it hit the net and it took the whole net down with it. So it was just
Really?
sort of sitting on the ground. And my colleague brought it over to me and we had just been talking about how I hadn't banded one this morning and he was like, yeah, we'll probably catch one. I was like, well, I don't know, but then we caught one that morning and it was just they're so big, like they're big in the field but then they're really big, like I had to hold it in a raptor grip because it was
Oh,
so
really?
big.
Have you done like aside from saw-whets, have you done like
Mm-hmm.
other raptor banding or like hawks and things like that?
So I went to a hawk banding place once, but it wasn't a super day. So we just caught one Sharpie, one sharp-shinned hawk. It was
Mhm.
like a really tiny male, but it was still nice to do. I got to band that one, which is cool. But on some like really good days, they'll get, like golden eagles and
That's
northern
wild.
harriers, which would just be insane.
I feel like I'd be too nervous to band a golden eagle, man. I don't know. It seems terrifying because I know like people get grabbed by the saw-whets a lot or they get bitten or people say like they'll just grab them with their talons like once a night. But I mean, I imagine with the golden eagle that could mess up your day pretty badly. Is is there like a specific way you prevent against getting grabbed? I mean, I'm sure there is, but is there like a foolproof way to do it or is it just like guaranteed you're going to get grabbed by a raptor at some point?
I mean, it'll probably happen at some point. There's like a way you can hold their legs. I'm not super familiar because I haven't done it very often, but I know with the
Mhm.
saw-whets, like there's a certain way when you're holding them, you're banding them, you can sort of position their feet so they can't get you. But I mean, it's inevitable, really. I've
Yeah,
gotten scratched by them, and their claws are wicked sharp. So I
yeah.
can't imagine a golden eagle.
No, I think a golden eagle would just send you just straight to the hospital. I don't think. I mean, I love golden eagles, but I don't see myself banding a golden eagle or a great horned owl anytime soon. I mean, yeah. Even if I really got into banding, I don't see myself going for that. Now you mentioned when the pileated flew into the mist net, it collapsed the whole thing. Do you guys have like different gauges of net for different? I mean, I assume you have to for like different kinds of birds, or how does that work? Because I'd imagine like if a red-tailed hawk flew into that net, it would not get caught, right?
Yeah, so red-tailed, it has happened before. I wasn't there before.
Oh,
I
really?
wasn't there for it, but I've heard of that happening, but obviously
Mhm.
pretty rare. But yeah, like the saw-whet nets are generally a bigger like mesh size so that they
Yeah.
get stuck easier. But for the pileated, I mean, we were just doing our standard. This was MAP banding, so it's monitoring avian productivity and success, which is our summer banding project. And they're just like songbird nets. So it's just fluke that it got caught in it.
Okay. Yeah, I got you. The have you ever experienced like personally when you're banding, or have you ever like the people you band with, have they ever experienced predation in the banding net? Because I mean, if you had like a passerine fly into a net and a sharpshin or an accipiter of some kind is flying through, I'd imagine they might just go for it because it's just sitting there in the open. Does that happen a lot or
Yeah, it can happen and like we try and prevent it, but obviously we can only prevent it so much. One time, this is last fall,
yeah?
a Cooper's hawk was in a net, but it was caught because it had obviously been trying to grab the smaller birds out of the net. There was like a ton of warblers in those nets and it wanted them, but it got caught. Usually they wouldn't get caught, and it was a female, so she was big, but she had this like sort of growth on the end of her claw that was stuck in the small mesh.
Yeah.
So we were able to get her. And then like predation happens. I've seen it quite a bit with mammals, actually, more so
really?
than accipiters. Yeah. So like I've seen long-tailed weasels by nets, and they're like really smart because once they figure out that the nets are there and they're catching birds, then they know to keep coming back, and they're like really dexterous, so they can sort of hop up. So that's a big problem if they get to the nets. And also raccoons are a problem as well.
Man, I was not expecting that. I love weasels. I'm obsessed with mustelids. I know it's kind of a weird animal group to be obsessed with. I mean, most people are like owls or wolves, but when I was like between the ages of like 7 to 12, mustelids and weasels were my favorite animals. But yeah, I could imagine that they would be kind of troublesome at a banding station. Didn't you catch a turtle in a banding nest one time? I mean, a net one time?
Yeah, I did. So I was sort of doing this net round, and I walked up to this net and I was sort of looking at it as I was walking up. It's like, that's a really small bird. It's a kinglet. I'll probably go take that out first. And then I'm getting closer. I'm like, that's not a bird shape. And then I walk up to it and it's like a mini painted turtle hatchling, I guess. It's like just so baffled about how it got there. And it was like perfectly in like the pocket of the net too, just sitting there. So I think what happened is a bird must have been carrying it. The bird hit the net, dropped the turtle, and the bird got out. So it just left the turtle.
Yeah, I don't even know. That's probably the craziest story I've ever heard out of a banding thing. Do you think like what bird would even be carrying a painted turtle hatchling? Like,
we were debating like kingfisher, but the habitat wasn't super good for kingfisher, so it was probably either a blue jay or a grackle because they'll both go for those.
They will, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's I knew I heard about that and I knew I had to mention it because that was like, just crazy. Now, for anyone who's looking to, I mean, who's on the line, like on the fence about getting into bird banding, like obviously you would advise it, but like what are 3 tips that you give to like start getting into it aside from like just volunteering, like any research or things like that?
Yeah, so I think if you're wanting to sort of know about the skills of how to become a bird bander, learning about molt is really important. I mean, it can be kind of a dry and difficult subject to breach, but once you start learning about it, it's actually pretty interesting. And once you know that, you can get really good at bird banding pretty fast. And then what else? Learning how to ID birds is pretty important for bird banding. And then also like you learn how to ID birds pretty well when you're bird banding. Like I've learned how to ID flycatchers pretty well and thrushes, like Catharus thrushes, because they were super tricky to me before. I just see a flycatcher out in the field. I'd be like, oh, it's a flycatcher. But now like getting to see them in the hand. Yeah, you see all the differences and you're like, oh, these are actually really different, but you don't notice those when you're out in the field. So that helps a lot. And then just like, I think how to get into it, just honestly ask around, just ask people, and most people will be friendly and they'll be wanting to show you and teach you how to band birds.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, maybe I'll have to do it because I need to get better at my flycatcher ID because it is horrible right now. Um, but yeah, that was a really good episode. Thank you for coming on. And I did really want to get more into that ethical discussion, about like science versus photography, but I'm probably gonna have to do that down the line, maybe a second episode at some time. But yeah, thank you for coming on, and I will see you later.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.